And a federal judge has overturned Chicago's ban on the sale and transfer, of firearms, ruling that the city's ordinances aimed at reducing gun violence are unconstitutional. The ruling is the latest in a series of legal blows to the city's efforts to restrict gun ownership since the Supreme Court ruled Chicago's handgun ban unconstitutional back in 2010. In regards to the city's latest law, attorneys had argued that the gun sale ban makes it harder for criminals to get their hands on weapons. In a 35-page opinion published on Monday, District Court Judge Edmond Chang agreed that the city had a fundamental duty to protect its citizens and acknowledged that, quote, the stark reality facing the city each year is thousands of shooting victims and hundreds of murders committed with a gun. But he added that on the other side of this case is another feature of government. Certain fundamental rights are protected by the Constitution, put outside government's reach, including the right to keep and bear arms for self-defense under the Second Amendment. Ultimately, Judge Chang found that the city failed to convince him that banning the sale of guns by licensed dealers was necessary to reduce gun violence. I was joined earlier by Ben Swann, investigative journalist and founder of benswann.com, to talk a little bit more about this ruling and what it means going forward. I first asked him to explain how big of a win this is for gun advocates.
Well, I think it's a big win on several levels. First of all, if you consider the fact that the judge went back to the Second Amendment and ultimately said that this is something, as you just read a minute ago, that comes down to government does not have the right to restrict or prevent people from owning guns lawfully. And he says essentially that's what the law did here. Though I do think, and I want to say, there's a little bit of a slippery slope here, because one of the things that Judge Chang did was he specifically mentioned the issue of Chicago's almost failed policies, even though they have this ban in place, the fact that there are so many gun deaths and gun murders in the city of Chicago, and almost used that as a justification for why he was saying that this ban was unconstitutional. In doing so, he's ultimately saying that the metrics by which the success of this law would be measured have bearing on whether or not it's constitutional or not. And I don't agree with that. I think the judge got it wrong in that case. That whether this issue is unconstitutional has nothing to do with whether or not it's effective in preventing gun violence. We'd have to get a little more into that in terms of the detail, but I think that that's the one slippery slope that gun rights advocates, even though they consider this a victory, they need to watch out for, is that greater good concept creeping its way into constitutional rights.
Okay. Now, considering what we're seeing happen in the city of Chicago with unprecedented rates of gun violence and so forth, do you think this is a city that could have maybe benefited from the now struck down regulation?
Well, it really hasn't benefited from really any of the things that Chicago's been doing. Look, Illinois was one of the last states in the country to allow concealed carry. Chicago has numerous gun restrictions, one of the toughest cities in the entire country when it comes to gun laws, and yet they have not seen the net result of that. You would expect that if you have more gun laws and fewer legal guns, you would have less gun crime, and the exact converse is true in Chicago. I mean, you take Chicago and you take Houston, which are two cities with very similar demographics, very similar numbers in terms of rates of non-whites, rates of poverty, the size of the city, population, and yet the number of gun deaths in those two cities isn't even close. Houston is about half the number of Chicago, and those are the third and fourth largest cities in the country. And so you have to be able to look at that and say, so far what Chicago has been attempting to do in terms of controlling guns has not resulted in controlling gun violence.
Now, Ben, in response to the ruling, Roderick Drew, who's a spokesman for the city's law department, had this to say. He said, every year Chicago police recover more illegal guns than officers in any city in the country, a factor of lax federal laws as well as lax laws in Illinois. We need stronger gun safety laws, not increased access to firearms within the city. If other jurisdictions surrounding the city had maybe tightened their gun laws, do you think, Chicago would be better off?
Again, I mean, I think it goes back to the fact that the argument can be made that if everyone around Chicago would have tighter gun restrictions, there would be fewer gun crimes. But again, you go back to that comparison between Houston and Chicago. In Houston, you have much more lax gun laws, and in Texas, of course, is a state where you can conceal carry in some places, you can open carry in some places. And in the state of Texas, and particularly in Houston, there's a lot more access to these guns, and again, they don't have the same kind of of gun violence. So the issue in Chicago, look, is really comes down to a gang issue. It comes down to a drug culture issue. It comes down to turf war issues. It comes down to family issues. There are a lot of different issues that surround what's happening in Chicago. And we shouldn't downplay what's happening there. We should really look at it. But legislating your way to fixing this problem does not seem to be the answer. It seems to be the answer that the mayor of Chicago, that the administrations there for several decades now really have pushed for. We need to legislate our way out of violence and out of crime, but it doesn't work that way. You can't legislate your way out of crime.
You mentioned the mayor. You know, the judge did leave open a window for the city to appeal the case, and Mayor Rahm Emanuel has already hinted that, you know, the city will probably do so. Are there any other options you would consider that would be more, you know, you would consider more fair, I guess, to regulate the sale of firearms?
Well, look, I think, again, the issue, and I agree with you, I think this will be appealed, and the fact that the judge left it open to appeal, again, that's concerning to me because of the fact that the judge really pointed to the numbers here and said, hey, if Chicago had essentially seen fewer gun deaths as a result of these laws, we keep them in place. That's what it sounded like to me as I read what the judge essentially wrote there. And if that's the case, then you're leaving it open to appeal, essentially saying, prove to me that this is working and it should stay. If it's unconstitutional, it's unconstitutional.
Right.
And that's really the point here. You know, what are the steps that Chicago can take in order to restrict this? Those are really good questions. And again, it gets down more into I think, the discussion of what is driving the violence there. I don't think that we can have a reasonable conversation that guns are driving the violence in Chicago. It's not that the guns are driving it. It's the factors, again, going back to the turf wars, going back to the gang violence there, going back to so many of the socioeconomic issues that are taking place in Chicago lead to the violence that ultimately is perpetrated with guns. But it's not guns driving the violence.
Well, I want to turn to the NRA because many people say its disproportionate influence has played a role in all of this. Recently, one campaign director for the Illinois Council Against Handgun Violence said that this is all a result of a systematic breakdown. He said that's the NRA's game plan. They keep filing suits and filing suits to chip away laws and get to their ultimate goal of a complete armed citizenry. What do you make of that argument?
Well, look, I think the NRA certainly, they lobby often, they lobby very effectively, and we see that happen. Whether or not that played a role, again, in what the judge ultimately ruled, I can't say one way or the other whether it did or it didn't, because I really don't know. I would suspect that lobbying the judge by the NRA wouldn't necessarily help. The NRA, look, they have a vested interest in seeing Americans own firearms. And the NRA has almost become kind of the poster child for the big bad gun lobby. And they're this terrible force that is attempting to, you know, create chaos in America. At times, I feel like the NRA becomes the red herring here, where we're so focused on what the NRA is doing. The bigger question should be, what is being done that's effective in terms of reducing violence, and not just gun deaths. And that's the other problem I think we have in some of the media coverage of this, is too often we look at just gun deaths. What's the overall rate of violence? And what are cities and communities where we're seeing those rates drop? What are they doing? It's not ever just a gun thing. You know, some folks will tell you, well, you look at the comparison of states where they have instituted concealed carry, you get concealed carry in, and violent crime rates drop. And that's true in some cases. In the state of Ohio, that's certainly true. That since concealed carry came into law, the rates of violent crime, not just deaths, but rape and aggravated assault, those numbers have dropped. But it's never the result of gun versus gun, more guns, less guns, as being the sole factor. And I think that's where we really get off track here, especially with media. It's easy to have the good guy and the bad guy, and I guess we just fill in the blank of who's who,
right.
NRA or government. But at the end of the day, these issues really are much more complicated than just how many guns are on the street and how many are not.
It is very complicated indeed. Well, it'll be very interesting to see what happens after it is appealed. But Ben Swann, investigative journalist and founder of benswann.com, thank you so much.